começar o terceiro dia do evento com o professor Dani Madrid-Morales, da Universidade de Sheffield, na Inglaterra. Os dois primeiros dias foram muito bons. A gente vai retomar a discussão hoje, o terceiro dia, uma conferência do Dani sobre research methods and comparative research. Well, we are very happy to have you here. It's been very good discussions yesterday. I'm going to speak in English for now. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ernesto. I am having a bit of a personality crisis. One day I speak in Spanish, the next day I speak in English. I try to understand Portuguese, and I don't know where I am. But I think I'm in Belo Horizonte, and it's 2:30 p.m. So today I'm wearing a bit of my more geeky side. I wear a shirt with my coding text here because I'm talking about disinformation methods. And what I thought I would do is I'd give you some ideas on what we've been doing over the last 10 years with some colleagues in my research on disinformation in Africa. And I'd give you some reflections, some thoughts on what are the problems that we face when we try to compare disinformation practices in different countries, and what are some of the solutions that we've come up with. And to start, I thought I'd give you a quick overview of something that you might already know, but it might be helpful to remind us of where we are. So this is a few graphs from a book that I edited in 2022 called Disinformation in the Global South, where we looked at disinformation in the Global South. As the title suggests, there was no clickbait there. And what I think is interesting about this graph, right, is this is looking at 4,000 journal articles published about disinformation from 2000 to 2020. And I think that it's quite obvious that there's a significant increase around here, 2016, 2017. And I don't have to tell you what happened in 2016. Which is basically that FC Barcelona didn't win the Champions League. That's what happened in 2016 exactly, right? Donald Trump, Brexit, and all of these other things happening in 2016. And there was an explosion of research around disinformation, going from an average of about 100 articles per year to more than 750 in 2020. Disinformation became this hot word, this hot keyword that everybody wanted to discuss. Now, what I thought was interesting in this comparison is out of these 4,000 articles, and I am a communication scholar. I know most of you are philosophy, political science, other disciplines maybe, but my interest was in communication studies. And something that happened in this explosion in 2016 was there was a shift in what was the discipline that was leading the study of disinformation. For most of the first 20 years of the century, it was mostly psychology that was leading the study of disinformation. Now, somewhere around 2016, 2017, communication studies start to grow the amount of research that they produce, particularly around social media, as we'll see in a minute. What was also interesting in this analysis that we did was the geographic scope of what was happening. And it's difficult to tell the different colors, but so the lighter colors are Asia and Europe. So you'll see that the largest chunk of research is about the Americas. But then there was also a research about Asia and Europe, and the Americas obviously includes North America and South America. Now the last graph that I wanted to show you, and that starts my presentation today, is about how much of that research was comparative in nature. And I'm very interested in understanding how we can compare disinformation practices and behaviors across cultures and across countries. And one of the takeaways of this study was there's very few research that was comparative up to 2020. Less than 15% of the research was comparative, meaning more than one country at least. And that's what we consider comparative at the time. And I think that one of the reasons why there's so little research that is comparative in nature is that it is particularly challenging to try to compare disinformation behaviors and practices across different linguistic communities, different countries. There's difficulties that come with the logistics of doing so, but also more epistemic and sort of ontological questions that come with how do you compare realistically practices that are so different in different countries. And even when you do research within the country, and maybe if we take the case of Brazil, right, probably the reality of somebody living in Belo Horizonte is very different from somebody who lives sort of in a remote area in the northeast of the country. If we do comparisons between these two groups of users or consumers of this information, how can we establish valid elements of comparison when the realities are so different one from the other? Now, the other takeaway from this was, as I said before, the very different. I thought the order was slightly different. Oh, wow, it's quite small. And I was talking about this the other day, right? You prepare the slides and you think you have a logic in your argument, and then somehow the logic doesn't make sense, and then you have a slide that's not what you were thinking. Well, there we are. And so this is a slide network, a very simple network of how often certain concepts appear with each other in the abstract of these studies. And I'm sorry that it's quite small, but this is the network for pre-2016. And if you notice something here, the main concepts, right, are media effects, issues around memory, children, women, care, patients. A lot of the disinformation research at the time was around health disinformation, around cancer, vaccines, and so on. Now, if I switch to the 2016 one, there's two really thick lines here that connect news and fake. So news and fake news, social media, and then everything else gets distributed. So there's a very significant shift in how we understand this information before 2016 and after 2016. And that shift signifies a change of discipline that dominates the discussions. So we go from a time where the main discipline that was leading conversations around this topic was political science and health comm and psychology, to a point where these disciplines don't really matter that much. And what's also quite interesting in here, if you do a citation analysis between the two times of two periods, is pre-2016 and post-2016, we don't talk to each other. And there's so much research that comes after Donald Trump gets elected that treats this information as a new phenomenon, as if it wasn't a continuity from things that have happened in the past. And that lack of conversation is obviously quite problematic. Now, let's rewind to where I was. So a lot of what I'm going to talk to you in the next 25, 30 minutes is about comparative research. And as I was saying, I'm interested in comparative research because in the area that I study, which is mostly sub-Saharan Africa, there's very little research that's comparative in nature. That's quite different from the reality of where I come from, which is Spain, where there's a lot of research that is comparative across the European Union and countries in Europe. There's a lot of studies these days that compare the reality of many European countries. And to some extent, Latin America also has quite a bit of comparative research, but in Africa, that was almost non-existent. So I am quite interested in trying to push for more comparative research on the continent. But then again, what I'll be questioning today is, what do we compare? What is the unit of analysis that we compare, and why do we take one unit of analysis over the other? And the basis of all of these is some of these definitions of what it means to do comparative research. So I'll give you two definitions that I think are quite useful. Esser and Hanich, which are two communication scholars that have led research on how do we compare journalistic practice across countries. They say comparisons should be between a minimum of two macro-level units. Those could be systems, cultures, markets, or some of the sub-elements. And they should be in respect to at least one object of investigation to communication research. Again, I place this talk today mostly around the study of communication. So two interesting elements in this definition, right? One is this idea of macro-level units. We tend to do a lot of research that compares countries, and we take countries as the default macro unit. But sometimes countries might not be the best way to compare things. And so they suggest maybe we want to compare systems, cultures, and markets. In the field of communication research, there's quite a long history of understanding media systems, and those media systems transcend the national borders. And there's the idea that there's some countries, for example, in Europe, Southern Europe, that have a shared media system that shares similar values, and that's different from Northern European countries where they have a different media system. So we could compare different media systems or different cultures or different linguistic communities. The second definition says when we do communication research, we have to deliver an important and sobering antidote to the assumption that anything we find based on a single case study at one point in time is generalizable with few or no limitations across space and time. And that speaks to me a little bit about what Ernesto was saying yesterday, right? And we had an interesting conversation yesterday, if you join us in the city center yesterday, about is the case of Brazil something that we can take as a generalizable model of how this information works? And in some ways, it is, in that Brazil is sort of the epitome of how this information expresses itself in certain contexts, but not everywhere. And what De Vries, which is a Dutch scholar, is trying to say here, if you read between lines, is saying we tend to use America as the standard, and then we apply American standards all over the world. And it is problematic when we use America as a standard, given that it's a unique country that is capable of electing Donald Trump twice. I don't think, well, you might, Bolsonaro cannot be elected twice, right? Why not? Why not? Well, maybe you are the exception to that. So within this basis, right, questioning what do we compare and how do we repeat the elements of comparison and why do we need to do comparative analysis? That's the basis of what I wanted to talk about. Okay, so now I'll be talking about some of the research that me and my team have done over the last few years on this information, and I'll be mostly talking about these 4 studies that we've conducted in the last 2018, 6 years, right? We started in 2018 doing quite a few comparative studies, trying to understand what is the relationship between disinformation and trust, and whether trust builds the acceptance of disinformation, or whether disinformation is what builds higher levels of mistrust. And from there, we conducted a range of focus groups across African countries. We've done a few online experiments, and more recently, we've done quite a bit of work in South Africa. So that's the starting point of what I'll be discussing today. And I will be focusing on 2 questions. The first one is, how do we identify sort of the most useful unit of analysis? How do we compare, and what do we compare? And once we decided what do we compare, how do we guarantee that the comparisons that we are using are really inclusive of the diverse experiences that people have with disinformation? The basis of these 2 questions are, on the one side, what I think is a problematic approach of using the country as the unit of analysis in Africa. As many of you probably know, African borders were drawn in post-colonial times, and so many of those borders were artificially dividing communities that are closer to each other, but now belong to different countries. But also because in highly unequal, highly polarized societies, like many African societies are, the reality in some parts of the country are so different from other parts of the country that if we compare them as a unit, we are unlikely to get any valuable information. And the second element there is, if we start thinking about the nuances of how different groups of people understand and process and behave and engage with this information within a country, we might start questioning whether we can take a national study as a valid way to make sense of disinformation practices in a certain space. So that's the basis of what I wanted to discuss with you today. And what I'll be doing now is I'll share with you some of the challenges that we face and how we've tried to overcome those challenges and some of the new questions that have come up as we've been trying to make our research more sound and solid. For some of these problems that I will discuss now, we have no solutions, and we have not found any solutions. Some of them are things that we're still struggling with, but others, I think, are lessons that might be relevant to you. So I'll start with quite a lot of the research that we've done around surveys and experiments. I don't know how many in the room are researchers that have done surveys in the past, or how much you've engaged with experimental designs, but these days there's a big trend, particularly in American scholarship, to do online surveys and online experiments, meaning that you hire a company, that company puts you in contact with people in a country, and then they send the survey to these people. These people fill the survey, and then you get data almost immediately. Right? You can collect 2,000 responses in Brazil for $2,000 in a matter of a week. Now, that process seems very attractive in that as a researcher, you save time by externalizing some of your research, what used to be a very manual process of knocking on doors or calling people and so on. But that also presents some challenges in that when we try to apply these approaches that are very automatized and very well run in societies where digital access is widespread, in societies where that's not happening, we come with certain problems. For example, in the case of many sub-Saharan African countries, we have found that many of those, what we call online panels basically is these companies keep a list of people who want to answer surveys for you, is that many of those online panels do not have representation from across the age, gender, demographic spectrum. Now, that might seem like not of a big problem, but again, if you think of societies that are extremely unequal in how people behave and live and experience their relationship with the media in cities as opposed to non-urban environments, that becomes highly problematic. There's a very well-known multi-country study that's run in Oxford by the Reuters Oxford Institute that studies how people consume information around the world. This project is run in 50 different countries. It's funded by Google News, so a very large project. And so they run these online surveys with countries, many different countries, and one of them is South Africa, another one is Nigeria. And what happens in those two countries, there's a little sort of asterisk in the text that says, this is not a representative survey. We could only interview people in the big cities. Now, that it's a tiny little punto a considerar, no? A thing to keep in mind, but that's not advertised as some of the limitations of that. And as you know, here in Brazil, right? So people in rural areas do not consume information like we do in the cities. Now, that's a problem. Obviously, I think I need to elaborate on that anymore. There's also a very high cost of running some of these studies. Those that I just described, if you do these things online, relatively cheap. But if you try to do a phone survey or a face-to-face interviews, the costs go to $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 for one single country. So those are costs that we cannot afford, and most researchers cannot afford. So those are problems. The third problem that is quite interesting, and I don't know if you've ever heard about this, this service called mTurk. Has anybody heard about mTurk before? You have, maybe somebody has. So mTurk is the service provided by Amazon, where you can pay workers that will do something for you for a small price. So, for example, you can pay them 1 cent, or I don't know, 2 reais, for them to look at an image and say, is this a dog or is it a cat? And then you pay them only 2 reais, and then what they say is they leave out of that, and then if they look at 3,000 images, well, then they make 6,000 reais, and then that's a nice job, right? Now, this has been extended. Instead of paying people just to label things, they also are hired to answer surveys. So they become professional survey takers. And that's a job in the US. And particularly among low-income individuals that complement their main salary by doing this type of jobs. Now, this has become a standard practice in the US, despite it being an exploitative enterprise, and despite several issues with the reliability of the data. Now, we try to do that in Africa, the same thing. But then the platform that you use on Amazon, mTurk, allows you to choose the demographics of the population. So you can choose by county in the US. So you can break Texas and then, I don't know, whatever small Harris County, and then within Harris County, we'd say, I want people from only this zip code. In Africa, the option is North and South. So you can hire North Africans and South Africans as if that was a unit of analysis, right? And so that didn't work very well for us. So methodologically, some of these things are challenging, but at the same time, if we don't try to use some of these tools, we also fail to understand what's happening on the ground. So what have we done to try to overcome some of these challenges? The main thing that we do is we try to combine different approaches. We try to find funding sources that will pay for this. But we also have had to rethink, not this one. We've also had to think about how do we ask questions across different contexts, right? André was talking about yesterday about the concept of impartiality, which seems to be a very contested concept, or a concept that has multiple meanings. Well, the concepts of disinformation and fake news are even more contested, right? And the polysemy of the concept disinformation or the concept fake news has been widely explained. I gave an example a couple of days ago that when we started doing research on this topic, we started by doing some focus groups in rural areas in South Africa. And when we did the focus groups and asked people, have you seen disinformation recently? Or have you seen fake news? They would say yes. And the first thing that they would say was, yeah, I saw a scam that came to my phone saying that if I send an SMS, I will become rich. Or if I don't send this message to 7 people tomorrow on WhatsApp, my whole family will die. We've seen those before, right? So that's what most people understand when they think of disinformation and fake news. Now, that's not what we were interested in when we started doing this project, right? We were interested in what we now define as political disinformation. Now, without making this distinction, there was a misunderstanding in how we were understanding concepts that we thought we shared. So that adds an extra element of challenge when we are doing research across communities, across groups, even within a country where different people will understand different things for the same concept, even though we tend to assume that these concepts are universal, global, and shared. So how have we tried to overcome these challenges? I'll give you 3 examples of 3 studies that we've done recently in this area. So this first example, I'll drink a bit of water first, is from a project that was funded by the US State Department because they were very interested in seeing if they could debunk or inoculate. They call it inoculation, right? So they wanted to inoculate Ethiopians and South Africans against foreign propaganda. So they were concerned that Chinese propaganda was being introduced in Ethiopia and South Africa, and they wanted to see if they could try different inoculation techniques, a bit of like, if you vaccinate somebody against this infodemic, you'll prevent them from believing that kind of content. So we were hired by the State Department through an agency, and they said, can we try to test this? And I said, well, let's try, see what we find. So we ran this survey online, and something that we were struggling very much to do is, for most of the people in Ethiopia and South Africa, Chinese fake news are not a thing. I mean, I could ask, how many of you have seen Chinese disinformation in the last week, in the last month, in the last year, in your life? So that was something we struggled with at the beginning, right? So how do we go to these communities and inoculate them against something that they've never even experienced before? So we tried different approaches. So one of the things that we thought is like, maybe we could show them things that the Chinese like them to know that they might not be true. And I don't read Ethiopian. This is written in Amharic. I don't read Amharic. But apparently this is a fake news story written in Amharic. I'll trust that our translators did a good job. And that is a story that the Chinese were trying to spread in Ethiopia about how successful the Olympic Games in Beijing were. There were Olympic Games in Beijing, as you remember, Winter Olympics. And there was a bit of controversy that China was faking the snow, right? Because people were saying, oh, it doesn't snow in Beijing, so all the snow is plastic and fake. So that's a story countering that thing. And so we showed that to Ethiopians after we had them play a game of how do you spot false information by foreign actors. The whole experiment was a complete failure. Right? The game doesn't work, and most people don't care about any of this. But the State Department cared a lot, and our feedback to them was, maybe you should be spending the money somewhere else. But we still did it. But that presented a real challenge. Jokes aside, right? And we faced this a few other times. Now we get oftentimes approached by European agencies and others asking us to do similar things about Russia and Russian propaganda in different parts of the world. And one of the first things that we tend to say is it is very difficult for us to find examples that people will remember because we, as a general public, rarely get exposed to that kind of content, even though it's very worrying to some European capitals. The second example that I wanted to show you is another experiment that we tried during COVID, an experiment where we were trying to see how easy it is for people to receive messages that try to challenge disinformation on COVID-19. And this specific experiment that we tried was a manipulation where we showed people one of four videos. I think I can play them, actually. Is there a mouse here? You know the mouse? Yes. Is this the mouse? It's okay. Oh, yes. It does work. So it's a video produced by the World Health Organization where there's a person chatting about COVID-19 disinformation, and they ask, oh, should I be concerned about the vaccine? Yes, no, yes, no. And then in the end, they say, just go get vaccinated. That's what the video is about. So in this project, we thought, is there an impact of who tells that, who shares that message, right? So these are four exact videos. They're the same thing. The only difference is who is posting this message: the World Health Organization, the National Health Service of South Africa, or two political parties, the party in the government and the opposition party. And that was a project funded by the WHO that was very interested in seeing whether disseminating messages through local channels was effective or not. And now we struggled a lot with this project. And one of the main reasons was, as I showed you earlier, we have learned that if we use some of these online panels that are available for hire, we do not reach the entire population because many people are not on those panels. So what we did with this study is we bought Facebook ads. So we placed Facebook ads on Facebook, and we targeted people through Facebook ads. A bit of an intrusive process, somewhat ethically challenging because we don't want to pay Meta, but Meta is the only way we can access these people. So we did that on Meta. Now, we faced one unexpected challenge, which was that every time people would get our invitation to take this study, they would comment at the bottom of, is this a scam? Is this yet another scam, right? People are so constantly exposed to scams that they were asking, if I click on this, will I lose money? Or if I click on this, is this going to really pay me the money that they're saying they're going to pay me? So our Facebook account got about 90,000 messages of people asking us, is this real or is this not real? In the end, the experiment worked, but we spent a lot of money and time doing this to eventually find out that it makes no difference who's telling the message. Contrary to our belief, the experiment did not say World Health Organization is not more effective than any others. Once you control for multiple different variables, it doesn't matter who tells the message. It's the message that actually works, which in part is explainable, right? If the message is strong enough, the messenger might not be that important in the context of COVID-19. So the first example that I showed you earlier, right, is the challenges of how do you communicate, or how do you study something that might be of relevance for your funding agency or for whoever is asking you to do that study, but then it might not be relevant for the local population. The second example is showing you that in a context of general distrust, how do you run research on this information that might be increasing people's distrust in a context of high distrust? And the third example that I wanted to show you is a bit of a creative experiment that we tried for WhatsApp. I know that something that we share, Brazilians and Spanish people, is that we use WhatsApp a lot, and we all have uncles and aunties on WhatsApp, no? Tías do Zap. So we also have them in Spain, and they also have them all over Africa. Right? Every time we run a focus group, the first thing that they tell us is, yes, I have an uncle who keeps telling me videos about how the flat is Earth. So we knew that WhatsApp is a source of this information, but we have always struggled. How do we study those spaces? And is there anything we can do to counter the disinformation that circulates on those spaces? So while COVID-19 was happening and we were all locked at home and we seemed to have a lot of free time at the time, if you didn't have children, at least in my case, so I had all free time. And so we tried this experiment, which was very labor intensive. So we built a series of WhatsApp groups, and we invited people to join those WhatsApp groups. And then over the course of 3 weeks, we would share high quality information about the COVID-19 vaccine with those groups. And then we had another group that received no information about COVID-19. We shared information about the environment, right? So one was what we would call the control group, and the other one was the treatment group. One group was exposed on a regular basis to high quality content. The other one did not. We let discussions happen in those groups. So people would receive those messages and then they would have regular discussions. We had a bunch of these groups. And our goal was to try to understand, does provision of high quality information in a group increase people's knowledge about COVID-19 and then the uptake of the COVID-19 vaccine? And could we also monitor whether people having a discussion that countered the message or supported the message had any impact on these outcomes? Of these three examples that I gave you here, that was the most successful one. Here we observed that for the treatment group, where we shared information that was quality information, and when the discussion in that group did not elicit counter messaging, right? So people were not opposing the message that we were sharing. Those groups were much more likely to get a COVID-19 vaccine, and they were a lot more likely to believe the general knowledge about COVID-19 in those two groups. So that was a very good example, right? In this case, it was labor intensive. We could not infiltrate groups that people have, but we create our own groups. We invited people through multiple different means, and eventually that was an experiment that was quite successful. They knew it was an experiment, so they knew that they were sharing, they were coming to a group where we learn about things. We did not disclose at the beginning of the project everything that was going to happen, but they came voluntarily. We did not lie to them in that sense. No, I mean, it's a valid point, right? I mean, it would be very unethical if we bring them to a group and we don't tell them who we are. So that's the first sort of set of problems that we face. And maybe some of you have experienced with some of these things, and I would love to hear some of your comments on whether some of these things are applicable to Brazil or not. But these are not the only issues that we've faced. The second element that I thought I would discuss today is what is the most valid unit of analysis for this type of comparative work. And maybe in Brazil, because it's such a big country, things are slightly different. But for many of the countries that we have in Africa, and as you've already heard from me before, there tends to be this tendency of bringing Africa as a whole, as if it was one country. There's this joke that says Africa is a country, right, not a continent, because we tend to think of Africa as a single unit and disregarding the differences between them. But if we try to bring research practices that we see elsewhere. Right? In Europe, it's very common to compare the realities across different countries. It is very common in the US to compare realities between different states. It's very common for other parts of the world to compare at a national level, but is the country the best way to compare things? Now, a few things to think about in this area. The first is, as I said before, most of the societies that I study are highly unequal. I shared a statistic a couple of days ago that, for example, in a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo, only 20% of the population consumes news online on a regular basis. So that means that 80% of the population are not online regularly. But that is not a nationwide statistic. People in the city, in the capital, in Kinshasa, are high users of online content. YouTube, for example, is very popular in Kinshasa as a news source. So if we bundle the whole of the country together, we are logically not going to get a very good picture of the situation. But then if we start thinking about the nuances of the population and how different groups are, the designs of our studies become a lot more complex. And yes, it's something that we've already known for years, right? Anybody who does quantitative research knows that we need to sample properly and accordingly. But at the same time, we are dealing with countries that are a lot less homogeneous than, say, Latvia or Italy or Spain. Yes, there's differences within Spain, but those are less visible than what we see in many African countries. Now, that also adds an extra problem, which is there's very different types of disinformation that people get exposed to in these places. I heard yesterday a lot about this hyper-polarized Brazilian political space, where the right and the left consume different media organizations, get exposed to different types of content. But then in some of the societies that I study, take Kenya or Ghana, these levels of polarization are less prevalent. The left-right spectrum doesn't exist. And a lot of the differences are brought by ethnic and tribal differences that tend to be connected to linguistic centers and different languages and cultures. So that means that there's very few overlap in how people perceive the world across different languages. If I am a speaker of Luo, a language in Kenya, or I'm a speaker of Kikuyu, another language in Kenya, we do not speak the same language, we do not read the same media, we do not listen to the same radio, and therefore our lived realities are extremely different. So in those cases, how do we get to understand their engagement with this information? So that presents a series of problems. The first one is when you try to compare across countries. We did a study a few years ago about how young people share information online. And that was a 6-country study in countries very different from each other, like South Africa and Zimbabwe. South Africa, a democracy, Zimbabwe, a dictatorship. South Africa, a multilingual state with 11 languages. Zimbabwe, a multilingual state, but with only 2 prevalent languages. How do you compare the realities? For example, in those focus groups that we run in these 6 countries, we showed people an example of what we call disinformation. And we asked them, have you seen this? And if you saw this, would you share it with your friends, your family, and so on? Now, obviously, we had to use a local example for each of them, but how do you pick examples that then can be compared across countries? The choice of the example already determines the outcome of your research. And I'm showing you 3 examples here, and you'll see that this one, for example, is about the death of the president. He never died. Well, he died later, but he's not caught, as far as I know. But then we could not use the same case for the. Yes, in every country, there's news always that the president has died. But it was hard to find similar examples across the different countries. Like here, we had a fake story that the president had been on the cover of Time magazine, never was. And in this case, it was the president was ordering the detention of the previous president of Nigeria. So in this case, we chose different examples for each country. And what ended up happening was there was no way for us to compare the results. It's not unexpected, but it's an outcome of the research process where the realities in each of the countries are so different, and the prompts that come from showing people certain examples are so different that then the results are basically telling you different stories. You can make sense of them, you can try to draw conclusions from that, but then it didn't work very well. Another area where we struggle, for example, and again, going back to concepts and what André was saying yesterday, this is from a study where we compare how media professionals and media users understand the concept of disinformation. When you tell them what is disinformation, what comes to your mind, and in which context do you do that? Word clouds are a thing that it's now forbidden in most parts of the world, but I still have a word cloud here because I like them. So why not, right? So if you want to see something here in the top one, right, I think that the areas that are interesting is when you ask media professionals, that is journalists, fact checkers, professors at university, what do they think about when they think of misinformation? They tend to think of media, news, and issues around news consumption. So again, the idea that disinformation is connected to the cultural, social, political news environment. Now, when you ask news consumers what was disinformation, news and media are a lot smaller, and we have a lot more WhatsApp. Right? So the main areas or the main topics in which these people discuss things are quite different. The spectrums or the spaces where they think when we prompt them to think about these issues is quite different. Now, this paper ended up making recommendations as to how can we bring those two approaches together and why it is important that we do so. Otherwise, that the solutions that we are trying to come up with from a media professional point of view are quite useless because the people who are supposed to benefit from those actions that we're taking don't really perceive that as something that they need in their lives. And this paper was published last year or a couple of years ago in Digital Journalism. And one of the main criticisms that this paper has received was from the reviewers that said, you're comparing apples with pears, no? Bananas with oranges, and there's no way that can be done. But at the same time, if we don't start engaging in this dialogue as to how do we bring the two parts together closer to each other, we will never come up with an answer as to what this information is. So as I was saying earlier, lots of problems and very few solutions. So if the methods that we have to reach the people that we might want to study are not very effective, if the ways we are comparing things are hard to compare because we are sort of challenging the unit of comparison, what exactly can we compare and why should we think about these things? So in the context of Africa, and that's some of the maybe specificities of what I'm talking to you today, they're very Africa-centered, and I don't know how much this will resonate with the work that you do, but there's a tendency these days to shift this unit of analysis away from the nation state to some of these macro-level units that I was discussing before, right? Linguistic communities, people from similar demographics. We've shown evidence in our research that women across countries tend to experience this information in very similar ways, regardless of which country they live in. And those are much more similar experiences and much more relevant points of comparison than we compare people from the same country living in different parts of the country, for example. The shift towards linguistic communities that I was discussing with Gianni a couple of days ago about, for example, how little we know about Lusophone Africa's engagement with this information and how much there's a connection sometimes about some of the narratives that are happening in the Lusophone space, in Angola, Mozambique, countries that are quite separate apart geographically, but they share spaces. You were talking about yesterday about some of these global narratives like the flat is Earth, or some of the macro narratives that started in the US and then they've transcended geographic spaces. We found it quite interesting to see that many of those narratives are very popular in English-speaking countries in Africa, but they're not very prevalent in French-speaking countries in Africa. For whatever reason, there's not a lot of people in French-speaking Africa that think that the flat is Earth, but all South Africans think that the flat is Earth. That the flat is Earth. The Earth is flat. Flat is Earth.
Good for France.
Yes, exactly. Good for France, right? At least they don't have a problem. They have other problems, but so we've tried to push this idea, particularly when we engage with stakeholders, when we are approached by people who want to study this context. We try to say, look, let's go beyond the nation state because that's not a very useful unit of analysis. And then because, as I was just saying, a lot of these platforms that we study become transnational spaces of information sharing. There's a lot of sharing across countries and across spaces on WhatsApp that doesn't limit themselves to a nation state. I think there's quite a few work done on how Brazilian and Portuguese disinformation cross the Atlantic, or one side or the other. The same thing happens in the UK, where a lot of the disinformation that comes from the US makes its way to the UK. So this transnational element of disinformation flows requires us to approach this slightly different. And so the last example that I wanted to give you before I take a break, obviously my brain needs a break after I say the flat is Earth, is our most recent paper that we conducted that was published also very recently about what we call strategic disinformation narratives. That is, lies told by Russia to justify the invasion of Ukraine. And oops, this was a project that was trying to see why it is that a lot of African nations, when Russia invaded Ukraine, showed support for Russia and justified the invasion of Ukraine. Remember when I said at the beginning that we tried to do that study where we show people Chinese propaganda, and that didn't really work because people were not thinking about this. Well, that was quite interesting to see that these Russian narratives did have a sort of transnational element, and they did really circulate across the continent. What was also very interesting here, there's a comparative study that we did in 4 countries: Angola, Zambia, South Africa, and Ethiopia. So different languages, different parts of the continent. And yet there was a common element across all of these countries, and that was that the main reason why people believed this, it's a survey study where we did an experiment, and then we built a model trying to explain what are the personal factors that affect how people believe this type of content. Was nothing to do with lack of literacy. It had to do nothing connected to them belonging to a group or to another. The number one thing that was explaining that was the anti-American sentiment. They all hated America, and the more you hate America, the more you love Russia. And that element transcended borders, transcended demographic groups, and started to make us question a little bit more about do we even need this sort of comparative research that is really forcing labels and groups and borders when sometimes those are not helpful in the research that we do. So what is the takeaway of this last 40 minutes? Or I don't know how long I've been talking about for. 3 things. How do we now, when I say we, is me and my colleagues, how do we now approach this information research that has a comparative nature? We suggest taking 3 steps in our analysis. The first analysis, it's a bit forced onto us by the logics of academia, which is we begin by drawing on previous research that unfortunately tends to be mostly from the global north, particularly the US. We cannot escape this exercise of reaching out to what has already been written. And that's our starting point, oftentimes. But then we try to get away from the constraints of the national to explore as many what we call sub-units as we can, because those are more useful in the settings that we study. And finally, we try to draw as many comparisons within groups. Oh, it's raining quite a bit. Yes, that's helpful for me because I'm starting to sweat a little bit. And to try to connect so some of these findings that have been happening elsewhere to some of these subunits. And I'll stop here because I've already told everything. Thank you.